Okay.
All right. Thank
Fine.
you. So, oh, you got to make me the host so I can set up the broadcast. But that's all I have to do now is when I'm ready to go live, we'll broadcast.
Yep.
Perfect.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. So, oh, you got to make me the host so I can set up the broadcast. But that's all I have to do now is when I'm ready to go live, we'll broadcast.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Thank you. So, oh, you got to make me the host so I can set up the broadcast. But that's all I have to do now is when I'm ready to go live, we'll broadcast.
Yep.
Perfect.
Hey, Melvin.
Hello there. How are you?
Oh, look at that. I like that look.
It's the t-shirt with the
t-shirt with the jacket.
Yeah,
Cool.
you know, with shorts on, of course.
As long as they're like basketball or soccer shorts or something.
Yeah,
Right?
they're actually dress shorts. It's like my
Oh.
rugby ball gear. We're also being recorded right now. I forgot that this happens on the back end, so we're good. But if you watch it on YouTube, this part shows. So. I'm not ashamed of my shorts. So Audrey won't be here today, so I'm gonna be kind of running things on the back end myself. Yeah. So I will be the person you kind of appoint to do things.
So Kimber did mention that she'll do the roll call, right? Or
I'll do the roll call.
Okay. So Kimber will, or you will?
I can do it.
Okay. Okay.
Hey, Melvin.
Hello.
Will I be able to screen share? I just want to make sure.
Yeah, I'll have to enable to like make you a co-host, I believe, which I will. So just don't.
Okay.
Because right now, hold on, I need to make Ellen a co-host first. You're a co-host. Kimbra, I'll make you a co-host.
Hi there. Melvin, I got an email from Councilmember Ramirez that he didn't receive the link. I don't know if it didn't come to him from Christina, and I forwarded him mine, but it said that he was signed in as me. So can we make sure to, oh, there he is. We're both, Lucas, this is a special day in your life. You know what I think you can do is rename yourself. I don't know, will it allow you to do that?
I'm not sure that he can rename himself on the on this type of like webinar. Hopefully I'm making it right.
Let me see if I can rename you, Lucas.
Just a reminder, we are broadcasting live now.
We're not broadcasting live, however, this is on the YouTube link. So
Lucas, I changed your name.
Great, thank you.
Great. Chief, would you like me to change your name, Chief? You are Jessica.
Yeah, I don't want to insult her, so please change my name to me.
Okay, hold on just one moment. Okay, so it looks like everyone is the right name today, correct? Okay. So is this everybody, Melvin, or should we wait? Or are we ready to broadcast?
this is everyone. We're ready to broadcast. Again, I'll do anything that was on the agenda for Audrey to do, I will do. Jesse, I'm assuming you know how to share your screen and all that. I've made you a co-host, so you're able to do that when it's your item, and we should be good to go. All right. So whenever you all are ready, I will broadcast, and the attendees will be able to attend this meeting.
Great.
Ready?
If everyone ready?
All right.
Ready? All right, I see. Okay, so I'd like to call the meeting to order at 5:03 p.m. This meeting will be conducted in accordance with the State of California Executive Order N-29-20, dated March 17th, 2020. All members of the subcommittee are participating in this meeting by video conference with no physical meeting location. Members of the public wishing to observe the meeting live may do so now on YouTube at mountainview.gov/YouTube. As noted on the meeting agenda, members of the public may provide oral public comments online during the public comment period for an item by signing up at mountainview.gov/SCREI_speakers or by phone by dialing 669-900-9128 and entering webinar ID 953-5767-4409. This meeting is scheduled to end at 7 p.m. and we have a large number of attendees. In order to ensure that we are able to hear from all speakers and progress through the meeting, speakers will be allowed up to 90 seconds to speak. Any emails received by 3 p.m. today were forwarded to the subcommittee. Emails received after 3 p.m. will not be read during the meeting, but will be entered into the record for the meeting. I'd like to move on to item number 2 now, which is roll call by Mr. Melvin Gaines.
Chair Kamei,
Here.
Member Margaret Abe-Koga,
Here.
Member Lucas Ramirez.
Here.
All members of the subcommittee are here.
Thank you so much. I'd like to move on to item number 3, oral communications. This portion of the meeting is reserved for persons wishing to address the subcommittee on any matter not on the agenda. Speakers are allowed to speak on any topic for up to 90 seconds during this section. State law prohibits the subcommittee from acting on non-agendized items. Would any member of the public on the line like to provide comment on an item that is not on the agenda? If so, please raise your hand via Zoom or press *9 on your phone. I will look through the attendees list. And Mr. Gaines, do you mind keeping track of our 90 seconds, please? Okay. Now we'll call on someone once Mr. Gaines is ready with the timer. Ready? Okay, I see David Peters.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Good evening. My name is David Peters. I'm a member of the Mountain View Coalition for Police Reform and Accountability, or MVCPRA. We would like to thank the subcommittee members and city staff for their attention to this critical issue, and we remain committed to working with you and envisioning a more equitable future of public safety in Mountain View. Since June, we've been calling for an independent, resident-led task force to review MVPD's policy and budget. During the last subcommittee meeting in August, Mr. Gaines of the city staff presented 4 police oversight models, including a community task force, which most closely aligns with our ask. Last month, the Los Altos City Council voted 5-0 to create a citizen task force to explore, discuss, and make recommendations on the presence of law enforcement officers on school campuses and the process for handling complaints against officers. The council also directed the city manager and police chief to expedite the process of collecting police stop data under the Racial Identity and Profiling Act. In light of this recent development, we would like to again call upon City Council to approve a resident-led task force to review MVPD's policies and budget. Los Altos has taken a step in the right direction, and we're all wondering, what are we waiting for? Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to Salim Damardushi. All right, Salim.
Hi, my name's Salim, and I'm also here on behalf of MVCPRA. We want to thank the MVPD for releasing their 2019 annual report, which will be presented later tonight. In July 2019, Mario Melendez was dragged from his vehicle through the window by Officer Benjamin Crutel and one other officer after they wrongly suspected the car of being stolen. As a result of this use of force, Mr. Melendez was hit the ground, injuring his head, chest, and left eye, and had to be taken to the hospital. The 2019 MVPD annual report identifies 26 uses of force, including 11 uncontrolled takedowns, resulting in minor to no injuries. How are minor injuries defined? If Mr. Melendez's injuries could be considered minor when he ended up in the hospital, what would a moderate or major injury look like? In February, the City Council rejected Mr. Melendez's claim that the officers acted unlawfully, effectively taking MVPD's side and deeming this as an appropriate use of force. We're now daring him to take us to court. After what happened to Mr. Melendez, how can we trust that the MVPD is accurately reporting use of force incidents, or that the city is holding MVPD accountable for their actions? Thank you.
Thank you. Miriam Connor.
Hi, and a big surprise, I am also here on behalf of MVCPRA. My name is Miriam Connor. Again, we wanted to thank MVPD for releasing the 2019 annual report, and we're really looking forward to the presentation tonight. One thing that catches our eye in the annual report is that over 17,000, which is about 49% of calls for service in 2019, were officer initiated or proactive policing calls. And so proactive policing is a form of deterrence where beat cops patrol the neighborhood and they look for low-level crime, and that's based on the broken windows theory, which assumes if we crack down on misdemeanors, we can prevent violent crime. And a common example of proactive policing can be traffic stops, which what we see in the report is that the traffic stops disproportionately target Black and Latinx people for whatever reason. We'd like more information on that. This was based on the racial demographics statistics shared at the last subcommittee meeting. So, we feel like the incident involving Mr. Melendez is a more specific example because it was based on a suspected stolen car, but no like call in by it. So we just want to echo the call made by the subcommittee members at the last meeting for MVPD to release a map of where these proactive policing calls take place. Because we already know that proactive policing generally targets Black and Latinx people, and we're concerned that it might be doing so in our neighborhoods too. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I don't see any more hands raised. And, oh, all right, I see one last hand. Alexander Brown.
Hey, just want to say welcome back, Max.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so I don't see any other hands. So I'd like to close public comment and move on to item number 4, which is minutes approval. Do either of the subcommittee members have any edits to the minutes or entertain a motion? Councilmember Ramirez.
I move to approve.
Second.
Okay, I hear a motion and a second. Mr. Gaines, do we need to take a roll call vote on this item? I'm assuming so.
Sure.
Or, okay.
Easier.
Just going by what we do at council, but if we can do a raised hand, happy to do that as well. I just wasn't sure.
Public comment.
Oh yeah, and public comment. Okay, so I have a motion and I have a second. Is there any public comment on the minutes? All right, seeing none. Mr. Gaines, do you mind doing a roll call vote on this one?
Member Lucas Ramirez.
Yes.
Member Margaret Abe-Koga. I didn't hear.
Sorry, I.
Chair Ellen Kameh.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. So that passes unanimously. Moving on to item number 5, our business items. We'll start with 5.1, which is an update and discussion of the Racial Equity and Justice Action Plan. This item includes 4 presentations The first 3 presentations are informal updates that the subcommittee will not take action on. The subcommittee will provide input on staff's recommended action on item 5.4, gender inclusive pronoun use in city policies and documents. We will begin with Principal Management Analyst Melvin Gaines providing an update on the city's Racial Equity and Justice Action Plan. Then we will receive presentations on 3 items related to the Racial Equity and Justice Action Plan. Those presentations include Jesse Takahashi, the Finance and Administrative Services Department Director, who will provide an overview on equity-based budgeting. Police Chief Max Bozell will provide an overview of MVPD policing data. And Mr. Gaines will rejoin us and give us a presentation on gender inclusive pronoun use in city policy and documents. Subcommittee members will ask any questions they have following each of the presentations. The public comment period will follow the conclusion of committee member questions of the final presentation on gender inclusive pronoun use in city policies and documents. So we will do the 4 topics and take public comment after the 4 topics, just to put that out there once more. And so we'd like to start with the update of the action plan efforts. Mr. Gaines, feel free to take it away.
Thank you. So I wanted to begin with giving an update on the city's progress towards the Racial Equity and Justice Action Plan. As you all remember, in August 24th, I presented the action plan and told you about the various different themes that it has, themes to assess police practices and policies and increase police accountability, to recognize and celebrate Mountain View's diversity, and to assess City of Mountain View operations and policies under an equity lens. Considering the first theme, assessing police practices and policies and increasing police accountability, we were able to wrap up our series of 4 Human Relations Commission community listening forums, designed to allow Mountain View residents and visitors to share their experiences about their interactions with Mountain View Police Department, whether those be positive, negative, or neutral. We held 4 forums, 1 in English, 1 in Spanish, 1 that was youth focused, which was in English, and 1 that was in a Mandarin language. We concluded the 4th and final presentation on September 24th. In addition, the public has the opportunity to share their input anonymously through the city's website. And we're still collecting anonymous story submittals through the website until this Friday, October 9th at 5 p.m. Additionally, members of the HRC subcommittee on race and equity are having some one-on-one conversations with Mountain View community members who aren't able to share electronically or were not able to participate in an event. The HRC will host a report out session on the various different themes from the listening forums, and that will be November 9th at 6:30 p.m. In addition to the HRC's listening forums, staff continues to evaluate policing data and to try to assess areas where we can make modifications. We're in a process of hiring a doctoral research fellow from Stanford University who will help the city by working with the police department and the city manager's office to further evaluate our policing data and identify any process improvements that will better enable the city to collect data that we can use to evaluate and identify any biases that may exist in our policing approach. We anticipate that the recruitment will be wrapped up by the end of this week, and the fellow will be on board and will begin helping us to formulate recommendations that we'll bring forward to the subcommittee, including us coming back in November to discuss police oversight models. Regarding recognizing and celebrating Mountain View's diversity, the library has a number of events. One of them will be tomorrow. It's a conversation or discussion with renowned author Jemiah Wilson, and the discussion will be on race, activism, and women's rights. That's tomorrow at 6 p.m. Later this month, the library will be hosting a 2-part series on the neuroscience of implicit bias. That'll be on October 22nd and October 29th. You may view all of these you can get more information on each of these activities and view the calendar of events on the city's website, particularly the Racial Equity and Justice Action Plan website, mountainview.gov/REJ. Regarding assessing the City of Mountain View operations and policies under an equity lens, we'll hear today from the Director of the Finance and Administrative Services Department, providing an overview of equity-based budgeting. We'll also hear about the police department's budget. And the city continues to organize and frame projects, particularly around the impact of historical zoning and land use planning and redlining. We are formulating projects to identify, we're identifying projects to work toward that, and I anticipate providing some updates at the next meeting. Ultimately, the Racial Equity and Justice Action Plan is a living document that every city department has been engaged in. We will continue to provide updates to the community through our website, social media, and other channels, as well as provide updates to this RAI subcommittee and to the City Council. With that, I conclude my presentation and welcome any questions you may have.
Great, thank you. Do subcommittee members have questions for Mr. Gaines about this item? Okay, so seeing none, I just had a quick question. So will we also be able to share this with city staff as well, correct?
Absolutely. I'm sorry I didn't mention that. We are keeping city staff informed of the action plan and frankly, engaging them in formulating the different items on the action plan. They're very much aware of it.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so seeing no other questions about this presentation, I'll move on to our second presentation, which is Equity-Based Budgeting Overview by Jesse Takahashi. Jesse, are you ready?
I will start screen sharing.
Great.
Let's see. Can everyone see that?
Not yet. There you go.
How about now?
Yes, we see
All
it.
right. Thank you very much. Members of the committee and members of the public, I'm happy to provide this relatively brief overview of equity-based budgeting. And it gives us an opportunity to share with you some information on how our budget process has been put together historically, and some of the things that we want to do to incorporate this new concept of equity-based budgeting going forward. First of all, this is really just kind of for historical point of view. Our budget process typically every year is a 7 to 8 month process. Begins in November, culminates in June with the adoption of the budget. And along that time frame, there are various stages of development, from departments submitting their budgets to those being reviewed by a budget team, to having public study sessions and hearings, and then public hearings in the month of June, and ultimately adopting the budget. Midway through the year, I'll just point out in February, we do hold a mid-year budget update for the council and for the public to show how we've been doing at the midway of the year. And this year will be no different. Gives us the opportunity to correct course and to make any changes and adjustments if necessary. So moving forward to where we are now in this particular year, we are all very much aware of the recent national events that have played out over the course of the last year or more. They put a spotlight on some of the social unrest and economic problems that are confronting many communities, including Mountain View in the Bay Area. We do recognize that Mountain View has a diverse population of residents in our community, and that is broken down along the lines of various racial and ethnic backgrounds, varying income levels, ages, differing political perspectives, and so forth. And as has been stated in previous meetings, Mountain View does desire to address more equitable outcomes and opportunities for communities of color and lower income residents, as well as others that may be disenfranchised or feel that they are not on equal footing with the rest of the community. One of the things that we've been looking at is equity-based budgeting in order to help achieve this goal. So what is equity-based budgeting? Well, before I get into that, I just wanted to note that equity-based budgeting is a concept and a tool that has been in use for probably more than a couple years in some cities, primarily larger cities around the country. As an example, San Antonio, one which we've actually are trying to model our efforts on around the city of Portland, city of San Jose, as a matter of fact, have all implemented portions of equity-based budgeting. And so it is something that, well, many of you may not have heard or are familiar with. It is something that has been in use and is being used more around the country, especially nowadays. Equity-based budgeting is used to address racial disparities and enhance more favorable outcomes in communities. And really, it's the way that it's achieved is by asking a series of questions, primarily how budget decisions affect communities of color and lower income residents. And that could be positively affected or negatively affected. So it goes either way. And where historically we may have looked at other factors in terms of whether something should be added or taken away, this equity-based budgeting now looks at how it affects a lot of these of our communities of color and lower income residents. So it really focuses on those outcomes to a much greater degree. And of course, the goal for doing this is to enable fuller participation in the economic vitality of the city and to contribute to the city's and the community's future successes. So it's really meant to bring up those that may have felt or do feel that they are not a priority and they're not getting the same equal treatment. Equity-based budgeting is implemented via the use of a budget equity tool. So this is a term that is used to describe this sort of mechanism, which helps in the process of evaluating budget decisions. The city uses these will use the budget equity tool to fulfill the city's commitment that it's made to improve racial equity and inclusion for all of Mountain View residents. So equity-based budgeting includes, as we've tried to sort of simplify it and down to 4 main objectives: to identify if budget requests advance equitable outcomes for residents. Another objective is to identify the burdens and benefits of decisions on communities of color and low-income residents or communities. Another is to ensure programs, plans, and investments of the cities reduce disparities that may exist. And then lastly, to increase community engagement in the process. So where historically, budget meetings and public hearings have been open to the public, we've not always had an overabundance of community engagement. And so part of the equity-based concept is to enhance the community's engagement in the process so that they become more educated, they're more aware of what's going on, and enable them to provide their feedback into the process. Some of the principles that apply to equity-based budgeting, first being applying an equity lens. And so that's a concept where a series of questions are asked to get at the question of how whatever budget decisions that we may make, the city may make, how that will impact communities of color. And it's really more of a focused way of looking at outcomes. And of course, it's all going to be dependent upon how the city decides, the priorities and what areas that it wants to look at. There are numerous components to equity-based budgeting. And as I mentioned, a lot of the larger cities incorporate this, but they have a lot of resources to help drive and to have staff a lot of the various issues that surround this. Mountain View is a much smaller city, and we would expect that while in concept, we would like to accomplish very similar objectives, that we may have to start smaller, get our feet wet, so to speak, and then grow over time as we're able to devote more resources towards improving initiatives and programs towards our communities of color and lower income folks. So the equity lens will really be kind of this focal point to ask and answer the question before any decisions are made: how is this affecting our communities of color? Another principle is that it be data driven. So it's very important to have objective data to help support the decisions. It's one thing to have sort of information or beliefs that we have, but it's another thing to really have hard data that supports a lot of the decisions. And so a lot of effort can go into and should go into gathering the proper data that's needed to back up these decisions that are being made. One of the third principles is strengthening or enhancing our community engagement efforts and equitable access. And basically what this means is that we want to communicate proactively. We want to make sure that we're educating so that folks understand the process and how it works, as well as to solicit feedback and to make sure that we are listening to the community and addressing those needs. And then lastly, being accountable. So of course, anything that we want to do, we want to be able to be accountable to the community. And we do this by setting goals and measuring progress over a period of time that we can then compare to see how we've been doing. So those are some of the principles that are involved in equity-based budgeting. Moving on to some of the next steps and recommendations. First, we want to recognize that city resources are limited. Again, compared to much larger cities that staff full offices for equity budgeting, we don't have a separate department or office for that. So we do recognize that we have to start small and continue to work on this. We want to assess our city operations and policies in the context of equity-based budgeting and recognize this is the first step towards integrating this into our annual budget process. The process we expect that will grow over time as resources allow additional initiatives and data collection. And then what we are recommending is that we do incorporate this into our upcoming fiscal 22 budget process. And we will be bringing this concept, or we'd like to bring this concept to the full council in November when we bring to them our first quarterly budget update. I also want to mention that we would be or will be doing conducting a strategic visioning and goal setting process with the council in early 2021, as well as establishing a Budget 101 workshop and enhanced community engagement for the purpose of outreach and to enhance our education process of the budget. And so really, before we come down to our last question, I guess, for the subcommittee, because we do want the subcommittee to endorse this, going to the council, full council, where we will be proposing the use of this concept. We would like to ask the question if the subcommittee is in agreement with the recommendation. And that is the end of the my presentation.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Takahashi. So I'll bring it back to the subcommittee to see if they have any questions. Councilmember Ramirez.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Jesse. This is an exciting concept, and I'm eager to see where it goes. So just for my benefit, does a budget equity tool exist that you're planning to propose, or are we creating one, or are we modifying an existing one? So what exactly will that look like?
So the equity tool is still to be developed, and that's something that we would bring back in November. We would flesh it out a little bit more to incorporate some of the more specific questions and objectives that we want to answer. So this is really tonight is just more of a conceptual look at that to see if that's something that the committee is interested to continue to pursue and ultimately incorporate into the budget process for next year. So we would bring back more specific questions to formulate that tool so that the full council would have a better idea of here's sort of the specific things that we want to accomplish or goals and questions to answer. And then as we proceed in with developing the budget process and, recommendations are starting to come in, we will evaluate using that tool and those questions to answer how is it affecting these communities that we are trying to address.
Okay, so we're creating our own. It sounds like from scratch, based on our own values and priorities, and not using an existing tool or modifying a tool that another city is using.
Yeah. And I think what we do is we start with the ideas, because a lot of it is a series of questions, and to some degree there's overlap. But I think what we want to do is to tailor it to the specific needs of our community, and where do we want to focus. There's many different areas throughout the city where we can address, but it would be very difficult, I think, to throw resources at all of them, right? So we need to start out small, focus on what council determines would be sort of the most pressing priorities, and then go from there.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. And then,
sorry, Councilmember Ramirez, before you get going, I saw the city manager's hand up, so I just want to make sure to acknowledge her in case before you ask your next question. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Vice Mayor Kamei. I was just going to add to that in most of the cities that are using this kind of tool, so the budget equity tool, to your question, the tool does exist. It is out there. However, but what we want to do is really tailor it to Mountain View. So essentially what you said, the series of questions that are asked are things like, does this program advance economic and racial equity for residents in our community? So it's really doing a deep dive and literally asking specific questions about programs that are funded in the budget, or new positions, or new programs that may be added. And it's really looking at it through that equity lens. So what we wanted to do tonight was to really just introduce this to the subcommittee, because this was something that was raised by the subcommittee, I believe, in our first meeting, and make sure that we presented what the concept was. But I really think what we're going to have to do is distill down what's going to work in Mountain View, because all of the cities that are using this they're just some of the largest cities in the country. So we have to figure out what's going to work here, because a lot of them, as Director Takahashi said, they have numerous staff and like departments of equity. So we're going to have to figure out what works. We can do it here, but it's just figuring out what questions we would be asking here. So that's the work that staff is going to be doing over the next month or two. So really it's just introducing that to you all now, and then moving forward from there.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. And then two additional quick questions. Where, I guess, would the tool be used? Would it be at the department level as they're submitting budget requests? okay, so at the very beginning and not at like, you know, the FASD or city manager sort of, they go to a central hub, and then the central hub is where the tool is applied, and then that's where what goes to council. So it starts right at the beginning.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Wow.
would say each department that will be part of the budget instructions that they would be sent out. So as they are putting together their, you know, request, they're going to be evaluating through that lens before they submit it, knowing that then it's the city manager and the budget review team that will get submitted and ultimately to the council.
Great. Okay, now that's good to know. Thank you. And then the final question is, it feels like the time frame is a bit tight because we're going to be starting the budget process very soon. So, and I appreciate, I think the remarks earlier about starting small and growing over time. How do you envision incorporating this tool into year one? So will the council have to approve a policy, you know, over the next several months, and then it'll be deployed in kind of a limited way towards the end in year one? Or are you envisioning coming to council with a fleshed out proposal, you know, in just the next month or two that we can then deploy, you know, moving forward? Do you have a sense of when precisely we'll be able to incorporate the tool into this coming budget process?
Well, I think a lot will depend upon, there's a lot of moving parts that are going on right now. Obviously, we also have an election, and so that will also kind of change the mix potentially of the council. But we also are trying to incorporate a strategic visioning process into that. And so a lot of this is, again, to come up with what are the priorities. You know, and I think the city manager may want to add the specific time frame if there is that. Right now, we don't have a step-by-step time, you know, month-by-month schedule that we have, but we would like to be able to at least get the concept approved so that we can then start putting more concrete steps in place to try to build that structure and how it would look.
Yeah, and Council Member Ramirez, I would just add that because this is something that is just so recent, that this is a concept that just came to us. And so we didn't want to not do anything because we believe it's really important. So we think that what we can begin to do in this first year of doing it is really assess what questions we could be asking. What does the budget equity tool even mean in Mountain View? And also really thinking of the community engagement component of it, because that's something that we can certainly make more robust. So as Jesse mentioned, the Budget 101 workshop, the goal setting and visioning process, which is something we haven't done for a really long time. So it's not just thinking about the questions that we're going to be asking, which we do see rolling out to departments as part of the process, but we wanted to be able to do something meaningful this time around and then ramp up our efforts. The biggest example of ramping up our efforts would be the data collection piece, because right now, when you even think about starting a whole process of an equity-based budget, data collection is really important, like what Jesse mentioned. So we have to even start that, and we have to think, what sort of data should we be collecting? What sort of data is going to help us inform our decisions? So this right now is just kind of the start of this process. So what we intend to do is come back to council in November with more concrete, like the questions that we would be having the departments look at, and then think through the next steps, which would involve the Budget 101 workshop, enhanced community engagement, the planning and goal setting process, which we have done normally, but will look different next time around. So we don't have every single thing nailed down with equity-based budgeting. How it might look this year compared to 2 or 3 years from now will probably be different. So this really is the first step in Mountain View embracing this as in how we can do it with our limited resources now.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's all I've got.
Great, thank you. Mayor Abe Koga.
Thank you. A lot of my questions were already answered, but I wanted to dive a little deeper on the issue of the questions to be asked or what our goals are. And that was my first question when I read the staff report is how do we decide what our measurable goals are going to be and uh, relative to community engagement. So is the thought, do we go out to the community to hear from the public what their goals are, what they would like to see as our goals, or are you saying you'd come up with like a draft of that and then we take it out to the public?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing for us starting, because we're just starting on this now, so it's not like we have a year to plan. I think the community engagement piece is really going to be part of the visioning and goal setting process too, because we need to think about the next year or two. So I see that being part of it. The questions that we would be asking of the departments will really be built into the budget development process. So that's not necessarily something that's going to come next year. That's going to be what we're going to present to council in November with the suggested lens that we look through. The data piece, I think we need more time to develop what those data sets might be. So what it is we're going to even be looking at. And this is something that's going to take more time than just, the month or so that we've had to even, kind of think through it. But it's really thinking about dashboards. It's thinking about how we're serving our community members and the different communities of color. So I can't say that we have all of the answers right now. This is really just kind of the first step in saying we're going to ask a set of questions of the departments. We're going to assess what sort of data we should be collecting. And through the community engagement process, we will hear from the community and the visioning process. So I think if the subcommittee has ideas or direction on what they think would be most helpful to hear from the community, that will be helpful to staff as well.
Great. And earlier this year, actually the three of us signed on to a pledge that was organized by the County Board of Supervisors and two members of the San Jose City Council. It was to look at budgeting from an equity lens. And so in light of, Melvin, you mentioned San Jose has this, or have they engaged in this process already, or are they also beginning the process, I guess is the question. And at some point, and I think we just might have to do some follow-up, because when we signed that pledge, we were told that we would convene eventually as a region to talk about equity-based budgeting. And I know everybody's been busy with COVID, but we haven't had any follow-up from the organizers. So we need to probably maybe follow up with them. But San Jose seems to be, or they led this effort, the regional effort. So my question is, has San Jose been doing this for a while that we can look at? No, Lucas is shaking his hand. Okay, so we're all kind of in this together then, and starting the process. Is that right?
So I see the city manager.
Okay.
Thank you, Vice Mayor and Mayor. So I would add that the equity-based budget concept and process is a lot easier to do when you're in a budget building situation. So when a city finds themselves in a situation where they are having to make service level reductions, it's much harder to employ this full tool when you're basically making reductions across the board. So you're still going to look at it through that lens, but it's just much harder to do when there's citywide impacts. So from what I understand, and Council Member Ramirez, you can certainly speak to this probably much better than I can, but the city of San Jose did go through the effort, and this was prior to COVID. And then once COVID hit and there are certainly budget impacts, the budget was reassessed. And so I think that's really what's happened. And it's also why starting small is good for us in Mountain View, because there aren't a lot of examples that actually have a lot of time behind them of how equity-based budget has worked. As Mr. Gaines said, this is something that's really only just a few years old. So just in terms of San Jose, they certainly have the model, they have the framework, as does San Antonio and a bunch of other cities. So we do have a framework, and we have great examples of questions that were asked. So we're not starting from scratch in that way. It's just tailoring it to Mountain View.
Mayor, did you have more questions? Okay, and I think just from what I know, the city of San Jose announced, I believe, end of last week, that they were creating an Office of Racial Equity. And they actually had the person who was the director of immigrant affairs is going to take on the role. And so they're creating their own office, which I think they'll be working on all of this. So hopefully we'll be able to do some follow up there. Okay, so we've gone through some questions, and I do know that there was a question on feedback from staff. So do either of you want to kick off any of your responses to that?
Do we need to get a public comment, or?
We're going to public comment at the very end of the 4 presentations.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. So Mr. Takahashi, maybe you can just verbally repeat what that question was for our subcommittee members to refresh us.
I'm sorry, what the question that you had asked, member Kamei?
Sure. So there was a question in terms of feedback on.
Vice Mayor, so it is, does the subcommittee endorse staff moving forward with exploring the equity-based budget concept and incorporating that as part of the update to council in November?
Thank you, City Manager McCarthy. So I see a thumbs up from our mayor. Councilmember Ramirez, go ahead.
So yes, I think this is a great start. I won't claim to be an expert on San Jose's process, but if it's helpful, I'm happy to forward some of the documentation that was produced in the lead up to the approval. And I think there's certainly a lot we can learn from them, but I think there's also a lot to be said about we have limited staff capacity, and it's not a trivial thing to introduce this overnight. So what we do probably by necessity will look different, but as a concept and as a starting point, I'm very excited about where this will go. Thank you.
Great. Mayor Abikoga.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention, you probably are aware of it, but last year when the Vice Mayor and I went to the National League of Cities conference, they have a race equity, it's called REAL. I don't know what the acronym is, but it's on equity and inclusion. It sounds like they've done quite a bit of work nationwide, and they have technical staff who can assist. So it might be worth checking in with the NLC folks to see if they might have some materials and can offer some assistance for us to get this kicked off. But I do appreciate your follow-up, and this is really important, and I look forward to getting it going. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Mayor. So I don't have any questions myself, since I know that I've been talking about equity-based budgeting for a while. And thanks, Mayor, for bringing up the National League of Cities. They did quite a bit of workshops last year discussing this. So the points I'd like to highlight are, I appreciate that staff is putting this out on our website, and that this will be a public process, as well as proactively communicating, as well as soliciting community engagement. I think that's really critical as we're formulating both our principles and the questions that we're asking. I'd also like to perhaps find a way to incorporate language access into our questions, or perhaps scoping it so that the public knows not only are we going to be actively soliciting their engagement, but that we will be trying to do that in multiple languages. So I think that that would be a really important part of the process. I also appreciate that we're looking to incorporate this into our budget as soon as November. I do know that this is going to be an iterative process that's going to, be a bit, but I think we're going in the right direction and really appreciate staff's swift response to this item. So moving on to our third presentation for our police department budget overview. I'll turn it over to Police Chief Max Bozell.
Chair, can I ask a quick addendum
Sure.
to your remarks just on the last item?
Sure.
Sorry, Chief.
No worries.
But I want to very strongly second what Chair Kamei just said about language access and making sure that the community outreach component is integral to the whole process. One of the things that we talked about in the city of San Jose was data-driven can be a little misleading, because what we found is where a lot of the data comes from in reports from constituents comes from areas that are very engaged, right? So Council District 6, Council District 10, areas where you have more, affluent folks, people who, are familiar with government. A lot of the data comes from them because they're the ones who are reporting what's going on. And so that kind of leads to a skewed outcome in sort of the presentation of where the challenges are. And underrepresented communities where there are very real problems aren't as represented because there are a lot of folks who don't speak English or a lot of folks who aren't familiar with government. So I appreciate you saying that, Chair Kamei, because that's how you make this work, is not just by listening to the folks who are reaching out to us now, but also finding a way to get information about those areas or those communities that historically have not been engaged or can't engage because the way we operate government doesn't allow them to participate right now. So that's all. Thank you.
Great, no problem. And, I think it's also recognizing that perhaps the traditional ways of, holding meetings is not necessarily the way to get that engagement, that we can move to online or kind of other ways. We've also been trying to do kind of anonymous feedback, right? So just kind of making sure that we're doing all the kind of suite of different options to make sure we are kind of as broad as possible. All right, Chief. Sorry about that.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. While Melvin assists me and gets the slides going, I'll start off by saying that this normally 2-hour presentation will be done in about 20 minutes. I am under a little bit more pressure today because my colleague, the Finance Administrative Services Director, is on the meeting with me. So I hope to make him proud with my budget presentation for the Mountain View Police Department. So we'll start with the second slide now and talk a little bit about the general fund, the general operating fund. Just in context, this is one of 8 funds the city has. It represents about 42% of the expenditures in the city. So the entire fund's about 148 million, and the police department represents just under a third of the general operating fund at $44.8 million. Next slide, please. The budget's broken up into really 2 broad categories: personnel and non-personnel costs. The majority, like all city services, is provided by people, and that's represented by the 91% of expenditures related to total compensation, salary, wages, and benefits, and non-personnel services, which I'll talk about in a little more detail during the presentation. We have 144.5 full-time equivalents, an FTE. An FTE is 2,080 hours of scheduled time. They could be off for a variety of reasons for various leaves. We don't cut that half person in half. It's just a way of calculating a part-time employee. And of those 144.5, 97 are sworn and roughly 47.5 are professional non-sworn. We have hourly employees as well that comprise wages, but that's the budgeted full-time positions. Next slide, please. And in terms of context, over the 10-year period from fiscal year 2011 through today, the average of the city's budget for the general operating fund, the police department, has been about 30.5% of that particular part of the budget. We've seen a very modest increase of 2% of staffing increases, 2 of those positions sworn, 1 non-sworn. And In contrast, the city has had about 9% increase or 53 positions added to the budget. The population has increased 10% over that time, although our per capita costs have increased from $394 to $545 per resident, which is about $1.08 to $1.49 per day. The overall staffing numbers per capita have decreased from 1 to 529 to 1 position for every 569 residents. Next slide, please. The non-personnel services expenditures, training, which I'll talk about in a minute. The others, here are some broad categories in which it's comprised of equipment and systems and services not provided by employees directly. So for example, our officer worn camera system, the crossing guard system, or the crossing guard contract rather, which represents about $150,000 per year. Animal control is about $500,000. We have our CAD and RMS, which is called Intergraph, which is a database system we share with Palo Alto and Los Altos. There's other systems as well. We have vehicle maintenance and replacement. That's about an $800,000 budgeted expense. And then we have uniforms and equipment, which replaces the life cycle of various items like weapons or bulletproof vests, and that's about a $100,000 expenditure. Next slide, please. This represents just a snapshot of our training for your awareness. Training hours within our training budget, which is $150,000 roughly per year, and that is non-personnel costs. That would be what pays for tuition and travel. And the complexity of this, to try to keep it simple, is some training does cost us money, others it's already paid for through other sources. We do have post reimbursement that's available to us that's not reflected directly in the budget, but the state does reimburse some training. And we focus on what's called CPT, or continued professional training. It's mandated over 2 years by the state to be 24 hours. We go for about 120 hours over that 2-year cycle. We schedule 60 hours each year for officers. Our entry-level staff, when they go to the academy and they're not laterally trained, meaning they come from another agency, they complete an academy at about almost 890 hours, another about 1,000 hours of field training, depending on their performance, and an additional 15 to 20 hours of CPT over that time. On the right-hand column, you see a detective position. This particular one is just a snapshot of our child crimes detective assigned out of our crimes against persons unit. So in addition to our regular ongoing CPT training, as I've described, there's specialized training, everything from basic investigations. The ICI core course you see there is the Institute for Criminal Investigations. The OIS is an officer involved shooting and force investigations course. This particular detective would contribute to a part of the investigation along with the district attorney's office and now potentially the attorney general's office. A homicide course is an example. So in July, we had a incident involving a tragic death of an 8-month-old. Our detectives were involved in the investigation of that particular homicide. It actually occurred in San Jose, so it's not a statistic we report, but our detectives were fully involved in that investigation from start to finish. Next slide, please. There's been a lot of question and discussion about our crisis intervention and de-escalation training. We've talked a little bit about that, but just to provide you an overview, we do have really an integrated approach, not just one class that involves de-escalation. So you can see here that a number of hours officers attend. Over half of our staff that are frontline officers, sergeants, detectives have more than the minimum amount of crisis intervention training. We do also have intervention or de-escalation that's a part of our arrest and control tactics that we train on. And, you know, a high profile example of this would be the Mr. Jose Ospina's arrest, or I'm sorry, his tragic death on the footsteps of our Performing Arts Center, in which he was killed and officers encountered the suspect, and they were involved in a very violent struggle, really fighting for their own lives, trying to take this person into custody, and were able to do so without the use of deadly force, applying the training that we provide as a part of arrest and control. Next slide, please. This highlights our expenditures by division. We have 4 divisions within the department. I will talk more about special operations and field operations. Administration is the Office of the Police Chief, along with clerical support and some professional staff. We provide support for the fire department as well, so it's a shared service. Our Public Safety Support Services Division is our professional staff in our Emergency Communications Center. That's our 911 center, our Police and Fire Records Unit, as well as our Public Safety Systems, which is technology, software, and networking, not directly related to the city's network, but comprising the criminal justice systems that we maintain and connect with the state of California. Next slide, please. Our Field Operations Division, which is really the backbone, this represents just over half of the resources that we deploy. We provide 24/7, 365 coverage, as they say. And this is the patrol officers as well as our traffic unit. We have what's called collateral assignments. They're not full-time positions. They're officers that are trained and assigned to teams such as our tactical team, crisis negotiations, intervention, our field training officers, and our K9 unit. So just for distinction and awareness, for crisis negotiations, these are our officers who are really trained to negotiate with an individual. So for example, in August, we had a man enter a home, stripped naked, refused to come out, make threats to police officers. And we called in our tactical team as well as our negotiators. We actually asked our mobile crisis response team from the county to respond and to negotiate with this individual and get them to surrender peacefully. The crisis intervention portion of it emphasizes more not the negotiations from a perspective of like a barricaded subject, but a critical incident or an incident that requires de-escalation. So an example of this would be on the outset of the pandemic, we had a man with a knife out in front of a local business. Officers responded out. They were able to contain him, isolate the individual, take him into custody, and disarm him through their crisis intervention training. Next slide, please. So let's take a closer look at our field operations deployments. Next slide. We have our traffic unit, which represents about $2 million of resources, one sergeant, 5 officers that are assigned, 4 currently staffed. And this also includes the budgeted items of our crossing guards that are within this particular program. And they focused on traffic safety as well as managing our diversion program for young drivers so that there's an opportunity to go through education as opposed to the court system. They are actively involved in our major collision investigations, as well as even community engagement activities. And not all things traffic are all traffic. For example, last month we had a injury collision that the driver of a vehicle who fled from the paramedics, who was then detained by officers and brought back for medical treatment, was actually in possession of a stolen vehicle and stolen property in that vehicle. So what they encounter is not necessarily just the fender bender, but everything from something simple like that to something more complex all the way to our fatal collisions. Next slide, please. Our department handles roughly 36,000 calls per year. And you can see the breakdown by day of kind of the categories of citations, crime reported, the arrests, the dispatch calls for service, and the reports taken. So in our calls for service, we make a distinction between what's officer initiated and what's dispatched. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we progress through the presentation. Next slide, please. In our activity, you can see that we break the city down into 4 geographical areas. We call these beats. We assign officers to these beats. They're primarily responsible for patrolling and answering calls for service. They don't necessarily stay within the confines of those boundaries because they do assist other officers across beat lines. But the demarcation is the Central Expressway as well as Shoreline Miramani and then the city borders. Beat 1 is to our southeast, beat 2 to our northwest, and then beat 3 southwest. Our northwest beat is beat 3, and our northeast beat is beat 4. You can see the general breakdown of calls based both on officer initiated and also on dispatched calls for service. One thing that we do as a part of budgeting and deploying resources, which tends to get complex, is ensuring that we have response times that meet the demands and expectations of the community. So we do track our response times. We do in emergency and priority one calls, about 57% of the time have a response time of 4 minutes or less. Our average response time for calls for service generally is about 16 minutes. Next slide is a breakdown just visually of the graph between the 18,600 roughly to 17,600 initiated versus dispatched calls for service. Under crime trends, we have what we call reported crimes of Part 1 and Part 2. And Part 1 is what the Uniform Crime Reporting or the FBI receives from us. That's compared nationally with other agencies that participate. And that makes up just almost half of the 5,000 roughly reported crimes that we take on an annual basis. And the Part 2 crimes are all crimes other than Part 1, which you can see on the slide represents homicide, robbery, rape, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, and arson. Next slide, please. The Violent Crime Index, which are the crimes against persons of the Part 1 crimes, is just under 2 per 1,000. In 2019, it was 1.84. And next slide, please. The Property Crime Index shows the property crimes per 1,000, just under 26. Next slide. Our mental health related calls, they are comprised about 2%, just under 2% of our total calls for service. So we categorize our mental health calls based on what's called psychological holds. This is what's 5150 of the Welfare and Institutions Code. If an individual is a danger to themselves, a danger to others, or who are gravely disabled, they could be placed on a hold and then taken to a facility for further treatment. Example of this, just yesterday on the radio, I heard a person call us and request to talk to an officer because they were suffering from post-traumatic stress and they felt like they might be wanting to harm themselves. So they wanted to talk to an officer and put them on a hold and take them to behavioral services for treatment. Suicidal calls, these are calls that either involve someone who's committed suicide or who's attempted suicide. It's a higher degree of violence act or injurious act than a psychological hold. An example of this would be earlier this year, we were called to the lobby of an apartment complex. A man was stabbing himself with scissors and a knife, and officers arrived on scene, de-escalated, got the man treatment, and then put him on a hold. That would be classified as an attempted suicide, a little bit more severe and of a serious nature than a psychological hold. The various calls involving mental health are when officers make a notation in the call that there was a mental health component to the call, but it's not typed as a mental health call like a psychological hold or a suicide or attempt suicide. And an example of that could be, for example, we were out with a lady who was walking around with a hospital gown. She did not meet the criteria of being gravely disabled or being a danger to herself or others. So officers obtained clothing for this person, brought her to a clothing store, and then brought her to a community-based organization for services. That a welfare check would make a notation of potential mental health issues there. Another example would be we were called out downtown to an individual who was vandalizing a food delivery robot. When officers arrived on scene, he threw his bicycle at a patrol car. When they tried to contact him, he punched the officer. The individual was arrested for a variety of charges. You would not necessarily capture that as a potential mental health issue, but the officer would indicate in the call for service that there was a potential mental health component to that. But the vast majority, as noted, just over 98% of our incidents do not obviously involve any mental health component to them. Next slide. Our Special Operations Division is comprised of our investigations units or sections, and we have our Crimes Against Persons unit. Those individuals investigate the more complex crimes involving things like a homicide, aggravated assault, domestic violence, child abuse. Notably, earlier this year, they were involved in the 2004 rape of a victim in town, in which we had a DNA hit and extradited the suspect from New Mexico. They've also been involved in a number of cases like the one I mentioned in July involving the infant, as well as a serious domestic violence that occurred just a few weeks ago. Our Crime Suppression Unit is the unit that handles our property crimes. They're the ones that are involved when you hear about us interdicting more prolific vehicle auto burglars, larger cases involving mail theft rings. They also are involved in dangerous narcotics, such as you see photo the poppy plants that were seized, one of the largest seizures in the state of California of poppy plants, originated from a member of the public informing the detectives who then conducted the investigation. We have a cyber crimes unit and financial crimes unit. This was stood up a few years ago to really provide essential digital and forensic evidence services directly to us in a timely manner. They've been involved in such cases as a 10-year stalking case involving a high school classmate of the victim who over 10 years was stalking her. They were able to solve that case. They've also been involved in a number of cases involving child pornography, working closely with the Task Force for Internet Crimes Against Children, as well as our U.S. Secret Service and the local high-tech task force. Our Neighborhood and Event Services Unit, this was stood up to provide what we wanted to be a holistic approach to dealing with our homeless and assisting crime issues related to those who are living in vehicles. Rather than a patrol officer getting dispatched out to a problem in a neighborhood involving an RV, let's say, we have a dedicated resource in which the officer has developed contacts or relationships with folks, and can also provide reference to community-based organizations if we have issues of drug addiction. They've worked closely with the drug court for diversion and trying to work to get people in diversion as opposed to criminal prosecution. The cannabis team is also budgeted out of this unit, but they have not yet stood up as we're awaiting a business for adult use marijuana. Our youth services unit is the school resource officers. They not only provide services for schools directly, but their youth component is also after school. So they're involved in a number of engagement activities that I'll cover later on in this presentation. And special services is really internal services for us around personnel and training, recruiting, the training programs that I described earlier, as well as property and evidence. And they also staff our special events folks who work on the Shoreline Amphitheater concert schedule when that's non-pandemic operational. And they have been involved more recently in a mutual aid response to the fires here locally, as an example of the work that they do. Next slide, please. So in community engagement, virtually every department, every division in the department is involved in these activities, youth services, traffic especially, as well as neighborhood event services. And I'll just highlight a few of these for you. MVPDX, we started that as kind of an executive education program last year. We've broadened that out to a first cohort of community members to just provide information about the police department and police operations. The POA works with us as kind of fiduciary folks who take on donations rather than the police department to provide Cops and Gobblers, which is the Thanksgiving turkey giveaway to needy families, as well as Cops That Care, which is the holiday gift program. Dreams and Futures and PAL are our staple youth programs. We have mentoring, boxing, as well as our summer camp program for at-risk youth that we work closely with the school districts to provide those services to especially needy kids. Rape assault defense classes is another program we've set out as part of our portfolio of community engagement. And we do provide services, for example, cyberbullying presentations to parents and students at schools, as well as just reading to the elementary classes when they have the reading days at local elementary schools. Next steps, we have, as Mr. Gaines mentioned, Stanford Research Fellow. We are looking at alternative response models that we've been engaged with, especially with the county, and then potentially beyond that. We mentioned MVPDX. We are, as I mentioned, with the records management system, engaged with Los Altos as well as Palo Alto and the 3-city CAD and RMS project. We're finalizing those agreements. Just had a meeting this morning and very optimistic we're going to get underway and be able to upgrade our CAD system. That will allow us to be early on capturing the Racial Identity Profiling Act data that we're not required to start collecting until 2022, but we'll be able to get that off early with the upgraded CAD, as well as upgrading our records management system with the other 2 cities. And then we're also evaluating community partnerships and how we can continue our engagement programs as well as enhance them going into the future. I'm available for any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Chief. I'll turn it back to the subcommittee members and see if they have any questions. Do any of our subcommittee? Okay, Councilmember Ramirez.
Thanks, Chair. I have just a few. So one of the questions that we've gotten fairly often from the community is how does our MVPD budget compare with similarly sized cities? And I don't know if you would have that information offhand, but are we sort of similar to, or do we spend more than or less than comparable cities?
So I don't have that analysis, but I will just reflect that, for example, our personnel costs, as you're aware, when you get reports from human resources during labor negotiations of where we tend to compete with other jurisdictions locally and how that compares. And we're not the highest, we're not the lowest. The apples and oranges comparison with these budgets is some cities budget differently. So for example, Los Altos, I believe the fire department, which is contracted through county fire, is a part of the police department's budget. We have 911 emergency dispatching in our budget. Some cities may not. So it's difficult to really do an apples to apples comparison without a real complex analysis of each city's budget for public safety.
Okay, that's helpful. I have a suspicion that that's something that's going to continue to come up, and I don't have a full appreciation for how complex that analysis might be, but to the extent it's helpful in our work, it might be something that we may wish to do. But I guess I'll leave that to the other members of the committee to see if there's interest in exploring that. It may not have value. I'm not really sure. And then, so animal control and crossing guards, that's within MVPD. Is there a reason those fall within MVPD's jurisdiction?
I think logically, traditionally, police departments have over their historical kind of growth, often operated animal services. We have a badge here in our museum that's called Pound Master for someone who is responsible for the dog pound. And I think just over time, it's retained within the police department's budget, even though it's provided by a contract service through a JPA. Similarly, crossing guards, at some point, police officers or CSOs might have been the crossing guards, but over time, they've been contracted out to less expensive resources, and it's retained within the traffic unit's budget as a program within the department.
Okay, and it wasn't listed, but I'm assuming vehicle abatement is also within MVPD's purview.
Correct.
Okay. I noticed that beat 1 has more activity than the other 3 beats. I'm guessing that that's because downtown falls within beat 1. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Does MVPD have, or could a heat map be produced that shows where the concentration of activity tends to occur within each beat? Having the absolute number, but I'm sorry, go ahead.
We could, yes, we could dedicate resources to that and provide that.
Offhand, would you be able to identify where maybe the locations with the greatest activity? Intuitively, I would guess San Antonio Shopping Center, downtown, shoreline areas where you have greater, destination points in our city. Is that fair, or are they not really thinking about maybe?
So I do have a detective opening, Councilmember Ramirez. If you'd like to come on the department, you're absolutely right. Yes, San Antonio Center is a higher volume area for us with reported crime. Downtown, Rengsdorf corridor up by 101, of course, as well. So, yes.
I appreciate that. I'm guessing my music degree may not be terribly helpful, but I'll consider your offer. And then I'm guessing this is probably going to occur down the road as well. But I was thinking about if part of the objective is to figure out what responsibilities MVPD should have. Some of these things I think may be totally appropriate. Others I think we might have an interesting discussion. So, I don't want to talk about my day job too much, but animal control, for instance, in San Jose falls under Public Works, and vehicle abatement is, Department of Transportation. And there may be very valid reasons why those are MVPD functions that I'm not thinking about. But is that part of the analysis that you're doing to with the alternative service models that you're looking at, or is that something that we should provide direction on today?
The alternative service models are more around mental health response. Animal control has not been a part of that. We do have community services officers that after hours, because we do not have a 24/7 animal control service provider. And we do have also here at the police department a dog kennel for dogs that are at large that are located and found after hours. So we're not looking at that at the moment, but certainly if that's council's direction, the city manager's direction, we could.
Those are small things, but I think part of the objective may be what are our priorities for MVPD? What is the future of law enforcement and the work that you're doing? And it kind of feels a bit like there's sort of a hodgepodge of things that maybe we could rethink. I don't think these are the top priorities for anybody, but as I saw them listed, it occurred to me that maybe we can reflect on really what is it that you should be focusing on. What are the community priorities for MVPD? And I don't know exactly how to provide that direction, but I'd be interested in hearing from my colleagues about how do we approach this in a way that makes sense and really reflects the values of the community. That's all I've got. Thank you, Chair.
Great. Thank you so much. Mayor Abe-Koga.
Thank you. Just a small question, but in terms of crossing guards, do the city pay for the crossing guards? Is that correct?
Correct.
And then, although I've heard, I think Los Altos, where we share some schools, does the city of Los Altos pay for theirs, or is it the school district? Or I heard even the PTA pays for some of that.
I believe Los Altos Police has within their budget crossing guards. I don't know if that's the full compensation for services under the contract. Whereas here we do that, we provide the 8, it may be 9 now with Vargas online,
All right.
but we do provide the contract services for for full compensation for the contract for the school crossing.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So I don't have any, well, I don't know if it's ever a question, but I guess I have a little bit of a request. So for the report, I think it would be really helpful to do a little bit more in terms of noting where the data is coming from. So whether that data is coming from the police department, or I know on page 7 of the annual report, it says it's noted from the census data. I'm assuming that's the 2020 census. And then, you know, on page 9, I'm assuming that this for the trends is coming from PD data. I think it would be helpful to, as we're reading the annual report, to understand kind of where the data is coming from, whether that's the census or, you know, the American Community Survey, or directly from the police department, and perhaps in what year. I think, you know, I would assume that it's the most recent data, but I think that could be helpful in terms of kind of understanding the full scope of what we're reading and the numbers. As we're kind of discussing data, you know, earlier on during the presentations, I think that it would be really helpful. And then maybe being able to note, is this kind of a self-reported data as well, or is it kind of the visual assessment that I know sometimes occurs? So I think just kind of a little bit more would be a request that I have versus a question. So hopefully, I know that these 3 presentations are supposed to be informational, but I just wanted to put that out there. Do subcommittee members have anything else to add on this item? Okay, all right. So we'll move on to the last of presentations, and then we'll move on to public comment. So the last presentation is the gender inclusive pronoun use in city policies and documents. And we'll turn it back to Mr. Melvin Gaines.
Hello again. I'm going to try to be very brief because I know we're at 6:30 and we want to allow public comment. So 2-minute presentation, if that's all right with you. The city of Mountain View does not have an official or explicit policy about pronoun use in city policies and other official documents. So typically the city uses variations of he, she, his, hers, him, her when a non-gender specific pronoun is needed. In its recent update to library policies, the library board discussed replacing such language with they, their, and theirs when making updates to city policies. Default use of he presumes that we're referring to a male gender, and when you use he or she, it doesn't recognize people who identify as other than male or female. Ultimately, using gender-specific language is often inaccurate and it's not inclusive. The American Psychological Association endorses the use of they as a singular third-person pronoun and notes that doing so is inclusive of all people and helps writers avoid making assumptions about genders. Staff recommends that the city transition citywide to use of the singular they, their, theirs as a non-gendered pronoun in order to be more inclusive in the way that the city communicates. Staff proposes to initially update the city's approximately 250 council policies and administrative instructions, and over time as document processing staff time has capacity to do so. We also intend to employ this policy in all future documents. Ultimately, staff intends to pursue this as an administrative matter and to provide updates to the REI subcommittee and as well as to the city council, but we welcome your input at this time. Thank you.
Great. Do any subcommittee members have questions on this item? Okay, seeing none. I'll do the same. I'm sorry, and add a comment, which is I know that cities and the county have also moved to in a direction of a variety of gender options as we're self-identifying. So I know that in particular, actually, when I was signing up for my COVID test, there's kind of male, female, but it's also kind of being able to identify as others. So I'd like to be able to move in that direction as well for people to be able to identify. All right. Any other kind of questions or comments on the 4 presentations before we go to public comment? All right, seeing none, I will move to public comment. And Mr. Gaines, if I can ask you again to help me with the timing. I believe each speaker has 90 seconds before we bring it back to the subcommittee. So Salim, I see you.
Hi. I would like to thank staff for the presentation on equity-based budgeting. I wasn't aware of what this meant before, but it looks like a great idea. I hope, I look forward to seeing how it progresses. And I'd also like to thank the Vice Mayor. I remember you mentioning this, right, after the death of George Floyd at that City Council meeting. And I'm really glad to see this come to fruition. It's a really great idea. I would like to say, I know we're going to get into the details of implementation later, but I hope that the burdens of policing are also taken into account when we use this budget equity tool. There are known burdens. So for instance, there's a large-scale study from Stanford that demonstrates that police officers use racial profiling. They look at stops done right after sunset versus right before sunset. This is the veil of darkness test. So if you can't see someone's skin color because it's right after sunset, then that means you've prevented racial profiling from being possible before the stop. They find that there is racial profiling. Black Americans are stopped 20% more often. There's another harm from policing. So there's another study from 2019 that shows that adolescents who are stopped are more likely to display signs of depression and anxiety, even 6 months after the stop. So there are known harms that are empirically, verified. So these are data-driven, findings. I hope we incorporate them when we use our budget equity tool. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, Julie Solomon.
Good evening. My name is Julie Solomon, and I'm a commissioner on the City of Mountain View Human Relations Commission, or HRC. As Mr. Melvin Gaines reported earlier tonight, our HRC Community Police Relations Subcommittee, which includes HRC Chair Ida Rose Sylvester, Commissioner Annette Lynn, and myself, has completed a series of 4 Zoom-based listening forums to collect stories about the experiences of Mountain View residents, workers, and visitors with Mountain View Police Department. Our subcommittee would like to thank the approximately 80 community members who participated in the forums, as well as staff from the City Manager's Office and our nonprofit organization partner, Peninsula Conflict Resolution Center, or PCRC, for their support. We've also collected approximately 50 stories anonymously online via engage.mountainview.gov and approximately 30 stories confidentially by phone and via socially distanced one-on-one conversations. So we are excited about the community's response. The stories collected to date are personal, they are powerful, and they reflect a wide range of experiences with the police. And we are not done yet. If any of you listening, or someone you know has had an experience, positive, negative, or neutral, with Mountain View Police Department, please share it in English, Spanish, or Chinese by October 9th, either anonymously via engage.mountainview.gov or confidentially with one of us.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, Ava Tang. There you go.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. Eva Tang here with MV-CPRA. Once again, I'm excited about hearing about this equity-based budgeting, and I really hope to define more of the tangibles, and I look forward to what you have next month to see more of the specifics that we don't have quite outlined right now. I think it's really important when we're looking at data, like Ellen said, where does the data come from? And echoing Lucas, I'm sorry, council members, who is data collected from and who has access to giving their viewpoints? What does equity mean to Mountain View? I think that is a very important question to ask. And I think something that really needs to be taken into account is how do we care for our unhoused? Because even though they do not have houses within Mountain View, they're still here in Mountain View. And they do deserve consideration within our budget if we are going for an equity-based budget. Thanks for your time.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to do one last call for public comment. Okay, seeing none, I will bring it back to the subcommittee. Is there any other subcommittee questions or feedback on the 4 presentations that we heard today? All right, I'm not seeing any. Mr. Gaines, Ms. McCarthy, do we have everything that we need from the subcommittee at this juncture?
Yes, thank you, Vice Mayor.
Okay, great. So I will, if there's nothing further, I will move to item 6, which is subcommittee staff comments. If I could, if Mr. Gaines, could you just remind everyone when our next subcommittee meeting is at this point?
Yes, the next subcommittee meeting will be Thursday, November 19th at 5 p.m.
Great, thank you so much. And just to recap, if folks want to see more information, they're able to go to mountainview.gov/REJ and get up-to-date information, and staff is updating that regularly, correct? Yes, I see heads nodding.
Updated at least once a week.
Great, thank you. Just want to make sure. All right, so we'll move on to item number 7, which is adjournment. This meeting is adjourned at 6:40 p.m. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time and your participation. Be well.